The body lay on the dissection table, cold and still. Leonardo da Vinci worked quickly, his hands steady despite the risk. It was illegal to cut into human corpses, punishable by excommunication or worse. But he needed to see. He needed to understand. He made the first incision, peeling back layers of skin and muscle, revealing what lay beneath. He wasn't looking for the soul, wasn't searching for some mystical essence that priests claimed resided in flesh. He was looking for mechanisms, for the actual physical systems that made a human body function. Over the course of that night and many others, Leonardo dissected more than 30 corpses. He drew everything he saw with obsessive precision, muscles wrapping around bones, tendons connecting to joints, blood vessels branching like trees, the heart's chambers and valves, the eye's internal structure, the fetus curled in the womb. His anatomical drawings were so accurate that medical students still use them 500 years later. But Leonardo wasn't training to be a doctor. He was an artist, a painter of religious scenes and portraits. So why was he spending his nights elbow deep in corpses, risking his career and possibly his life? Because Leonardo da Vinci couldn't stop asking questions. How does the eye actually see? How do muscles produce movement? How does blood flow through the body? What makes a bird capable of flight? Why does water flow the way it does? How can you represent three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface? Every answer led to more questions. Every investigation opened new territories to explore. He couldn't specialize because everything connected to everything else. To understand painting, he needed to understand optics. To understand optics, he needed to understand light. To understand light, he needed to understand physics. To understand the human form, he needed to understand anatomy. To understand anatomy, he needed to dissect bodies. This curiosity, this inability to accept surface explanations, this compulsion to understand how things actually work, made him possibly the most wide-ranging genius in human history. He was a painter, sculptor, architect, engineer, scientist, mathematician, anatomist, geologist, cartographer, botanist, and writer. He designed weapons, canals, flying machines, submarines, and ideal cities. He painted two of the most famous images in Western art. He filled thousands of pages with observations, inventions, and ideas that wouldn't be fully understood or realized for centuries. But Leonardo's genius came with a cost. He finished almost nothing. His notebooks are filled with projects begun and abandoned, ideas sketched but never built, paintings started but never completed. He was so far ahead of his time that most of his inventions were impossible to construct with Renaissance technology. He saw possibilities that wouldn't become real for 500 years. This is the story of a man whose mind worked so differently from everyone around him that he seemed almost alien, a visitor from the future trapped in the 15th century. A man who anticipated helicopters, tanks, parachutes, submarines, and countless other modern technologies. A man who understood principles of physics, anatomy, and engineering that wouldn't be formally discovered for generations. A man who was, in every sense, too brilliant for his own era. The illegitimate son? Leonardo was born in 1452 in a farmhouse outside the small town of Vinci, in the hills of Tuscany. His father, Ser Piero da Vinci, was a notary from a respected family. His mother, Caterina, was a peasant girl, possibly a slave from the Middle East. They weren't married, they would never marry. This illegitimacy marked Leonardo for life. In Renaissance Italy, bastards couldn't inherit property, couldn't follow their father's profession, couldn't attend university, couldn't join most guilds. The legitimate career paths open to men of his father's class were closed to him. He would have to make his own way. But illegitimacy also freed him. He wasn't bound by family expectations or professional traditions. He didn't have to become a notary like his father and grandfather and great-grandfather. He could explore, experiment, follow his curiosity wherever it led. The social stigma that should have limited him actually liberated him. His childhood in the Tuscan countryside shaped everything that followed. He spent his days outside, observing nature with an intensity most children never develop. He watched water flowing in streams, studied how it created patterns and eddies. He observed birds in flight, trying to understand what made them capable of staying airborne. He examined plants, rocks, clouds, light, shadow, everything. This wasn't casual observation. Leonardo looked at things with a focus that bordered on obsessive. He didn't just notice that water flowed, he studied exactly how it flowed, how it moved around obstacles, how its speed changed with depth, how it created spirals and vortices. He filled his mind with detailed observations that he would draw on for the rest of his life. His formal education was minimal. He learned to read and write, basic arithmetic, nothing more. He didn't study Latin, the language of scholarship and science. This meant he couldn't access most written knowledge of his era, couldn't read the classical texts that educated men studied. Later, he would teach himself Latin, but imperfectly, always remaining outside the intellectual mainstream. This lack of formal education was another liberation disguised as limitation. He wasn't trained to think in the approved ways, wasn't indoctrinated into Aristotelian philosophy that dominated universities, wasn't taught to defer to ancient authorities. When he had a question, he didn't consult books. He looked at the thing itself, observed it directly, drew his own conclusions. He called himself an unlettered man, someone without formal learning. But he turned this into a strength. Book learning, he believed, was secondary to direct observation. The authority wasn't Aristotle or Galen or any ancient writer. The authority was nature itself. If you wanted to understand how something worked, you studied the thing, not what someone else had written about it centuries earlier. The workshop. At age 14, Leonardo was apprenticed to Andrea del Verrocchio, one of Florence's leading artists. Verrocchio's workshop was typical of Renaissance bottega, a combination art studio, engineering firm, and manufacturing facility. They produced paintings, sculptures, architectural designs, jewelry, whatever clients wanted. The apprenticeship system meant learning by doing. Leonardo started with menial tasks: grinding pigments, preparing panels, cleaning brushes. Gradually, he took on more skilled work, mixing paints, transferring designs, painting background elements in Verrocchio's compositions. But Verrocchio's workshop taught more than painting. Renaissance artists were expected to understand mathematics, geometry, perspective, anatomy, optics, chemistry of pigments, engineering of scaffolding for large projects, bronze casting, stone carving, everything. An artist was a kind of universal technician, someone who combined aesthetic sensitivity with technical knowledge. This suited Leonardo perfectly. He absorbed everything, asked endless questions, experimented constantly. He learned perspective and became obsessed with it, spending hours working out the mathematical principles that allowed three-dimensional space to be represented on flat surfaces. He studied anatomy by attending public dissections, sketching what he saw, trying to understand the structure beneath the skin. The famous story from this period involves a painting of the baptism of Christ. Verrocchio was painting it, and he assigned Leonardo to paint one of the angels in the corner. Leonardo's angel was so much better than anything else in the painting, so alive and real compared to Verrocchio's stiffer figures, that Verrocchio supposedly put down his brushes and never painted again, recognizing that his student had surpassed him. The story is probably exaggerated, but the painting exists, and Leonardo's angel really is remarkably superior to the rest of the composition. You can see the difference immediately. The other figures are well executed, but somewhat wooden, clearly painted. Leonardo's angel looks like it might turn its head at any moment, looks alive in a way that the others don't. This wasn't just superior skill, it was a different understanding of what painting was supposed to do. For most artists, painting meant creating a pleasing arrangement of forms and colors. For Leonardo, painting meant understanding and representing reality so precisely that the representation became indistinguishable from the thing itself. The notebooks begin. Sometime in his 20s, Leonardo began keeping notebooks. He would continue this practice for the rest of his life, eventually filling more than 13,000 pages with observations, drawings, ideas, inventions, and questions. The notebooks are strange objects. They're written in mirror script, right to left, readable only when held up to a mirror. Scholars debate why he did this. Some think it was secrecy, protecting his ideas from theft. More likely, it was simply easier. Leonardo was left-handed, and mirror writing avoided smudging the ink as his hand moved across the page. The contents are even stranger. A single page might contain anatomical sketches, mathematical calculations, grocery lists, philosophical reflections, and designs for war machines. There's no organization, no systematic arrangement. Ideas appear wherever Leonardo was when they occurred to him, crowding onto pages alongside completely unrelated content. He drew constantly, not just careful, finished drawings, but quick sketches capturing ideas before they vanished. A design for a flying machine, the flow of water around an obstacle, the muscles of a human arm, the pattern of branches on a tree, the shadow cast by a sphere, the geometry of reflected light. The drawings aren't illustrations of ideas developed elsewhere. They are the thinking itself. Leonardo thought with his hands, used drawing as a tool for understanding. When he wanted to understand how something worked, he drew it from multiple angles, took it apart on paper, examined each component, saw how the pieces fit together. His questions were relentless. Why is the sky blue? How does the eye process an image? What makes sounds loud or soft? Why do rivers curve? How can you measure the height of a tower without climbing it? What's the strongest shape for an arch? How does the heart pump blood? He rarely answered these questions definitively. Instead, he circled around them, approached from different angles, accumulated observations, sketched possibilities. The notebooks aren't conclusions, they're investigations. The record of a mind that never stopped questioning, never settled into certainty. Modern readers of the notebooks are struck by how contemporary Leonardo's thinking seems. He's not relying on ancient authorities or religious doctrine. He's observing, experimenting, reasoning from evidence. He's doing science before science existed as a formal discipline, applying empirical methods that wouldn't become standard for another century. The First Commission. In 1481, Leonardo received his first major independent commission, an altarpiece for a monastery outside Florence, the Adoration of the Magi. It was a prestigious assignment, a chance to establish himself as a master in his own right rather than Verrocchio's assistant. He approached it with characteristic intensity. Rather than following the standard compositional formulas for this scene, he redesigned everything. The traditional approach showed the three magi presenting gifts to the infant Christ in an orderly, dignified manner. Leonardo created chaos. His composition is a swirling mass of figures, dozens of people pressing forward, gesturing, reacting with intense emotion. The scene feels like a real event, a moment of genuine drama and excitement rather than a formal religious tableau. He included architecture in ruins, symbolic of the old order giving way to the new. He added horses rearing in the background, soldiers fighting, references to both the future and the past. But he never finished it. The underpainting exists, incredibly sophisticated in its composition and draftsmanship. But Leonardo never added the final layers of paint. He worked on it for months, maybe years, then abandoned it. This would become his pattern. He would accept a commission, work on it intensely, then lose interest and move on to something else. The Adoration wasn't finished because Leonardo had extracted what he wanted from it. He'd solved the compositional problems, figured out how to create that sense of chaotic energy, understood how to make a religious scene feel like a real historical moment. Actually finishing it, applying the final layers of paint, seemed tedious compared to the intellectual challenges he'd already overcome. His clients were furious. They'd paid for a finished altarpiece, not an abandoned experiment. But Leonardo didn't seem particularly concerned about their anger. The painting had served its purpose for him. It had taught him things. Whether it fulfilled his contractual obligations was secondary. This attitude toward commissions, toward finishing things, would plague him throughout his career. He was more interested in the process of discovery than in producing completed works. Once he understood how to do something, actually doing it felt like mere execution, not worthy of his time when so many other questions demanded investigation. Milan and the War Machines. In 1482, at age 30, Leonardo left Florence for Milan. He'd been offered a position at the court of Ludovico Sforza, the de facto ruler of Milan. But he wasn't hired as a painter. He was hired as a military engineer. The letter Leonardo sent applying for the position is revealing. He lists his qualifications. He can design bridges that are light and portable, perfect for pursuing or fleeing enemies. He can divert water to create moats or drain enemy moats. He can design siege weapons, bombardments, catapults. He can construct armored vehicles that can break through enemy lines. He can design buildings and canal systems. Only at the end does he mention, almost as an afterthought, that he can also paint. This wasn't false advertising. Leonardo had been designing military technologies for years, filling his notebooks with sketches of weapons and fortifications. Some were practical improvements on existing technology. Others were wildly advanced, concepts that wouldn't be feasible for centuries. He designed a tank, an armored vehicle covered in metal plates with guns mounted around the perimeter. The crew would turn cranks inside to move it forward while protected from enemy fire. The design was brilliant in theory, but impossible in practice. The materials and power sources needed to make it work didn't exist in the 15th century. He designed a helicopter, a flying screw that would lift off the ground by rotating rapidly. Again, brilliant in principle, impossible with available technology. The materials were too heavy, the power source non-existent, but the basic concept was sound. 400 years later, humans would build working helicopters using essentially the same principle Leonardo sketched. He designed a parachute, a pyramid-shaped frame covered in fabric that would allow a person to jump from a great height without injury. In 2000, a British skydiver built Leonardo's parachute exactly as he'd drawn it and successfully jumped from 10,000 feet. It worked perfectly. His military designs weren't just theoretical exercises. He understood warfare, had thought carefully about tactics and logistics. Many of his designs addressed real practical problems: how to move armies quickly across rivers, how to protect soldiers during sieges, how to breach enemy fortifications. But there was a contradiction at the heart of Leonardo's military work. He designed weapons of unprecedented destructive power while privately expressing horror at human violence. His notebooks contain passages lamenting war, describing it as beastly madness. Yet, he continued designing better ways to kill people, justifying it as necessary to serve his patrons. This moral ambiguity would follow him throughout his life. He was simultaneously repulsed by violence and fascinated by the engineering challenges it presented. He could design a weapon capable of killing hundreds while sketching birds and flowers on the same page, seemingly untroubled by the juxtaposition. The anatomist. Leonardo's anatomical investigations began as an artist's practical concern. To paint human figures convincingly, you needed to understand the body's structure. Surface anatomy wasn't enough. You needed to know what was happening beneath the skin, how muscles attached to bones, how the body moved. So he attended public dissections, watched doctors cut open executed criminals, sketched what he saw. But this wasn't enough. The public dissections were quick, crude affairs. The doctors were looking for specific things, often confirming what ancient texts claimed, rather than discovering what was actually there. Leonardo wanted to see for himself. So he began conducting his own dissections, working in secret, illegally, cutting into corpses to understand exactly how the human machine functioned. What he discovered amazed him. The body was far more complex and elegant than anyone had described. The heart wasn't just a simple pump. It had 4 chambers with intricate valves that prevented backflow. The muscles didn't just contract randomly. They worked in coordinated systems, with some muscles pulling while others relaxed, creating smooth, controlled movement. He drew everything with obsessive precision. His anatomical drawings show bones from multiple angles, muscles in layers, the nervous system branching through the body. He dissected the eye and figured out how the lens focuses light on the retina. He studied the fetus in the womb and drew it with accuracy that wouldn't be matched for centuries. But Leonardo didn't stop at description. He wanted to understand function. He conducted experiments, testing how much weight a muscle could lift, how blood flowed through vessels, what happened when you severed certain nerves. He was doing experimental physiology, a field that wouldn't formally exist for hundreds of years. His observations led him to conclusions that contradicted established medical doctrine. Ancient texts claimed the heart had only 2 chambers, Leonardo's dissections showed 4. Ancient texts claimed the liver produced blood. Leonardo's investigation suggested the heart circulated existing blood. Ancient texts placed the soul in various organs. Leonardo found only mechanisms, no spiritual essence, just physical systems operating according to natural laws. This materialism didn't make him an atheist. He believed in God, but a God who worked through natural laws, not through constant, miraculous intervention. The human body was divine in its complexity and elegance, but it was still a machine, one that could be understood through careful observation and reason. He dissected more than 30 corpses over his lifetime, an extraordinary number for someone who wasn't a physician. The work was dangerous, not just legally but physically. Bodies decomposed quickly. There was no refrigeration, no preservation except basic embalming. He worked by candlelight in cold rooms, racing against decay, breathing air thick with the smell of death. But he couldn't stop. Each body revealed new details, answered old questions while raising new ones. How did the vocal cords produce sound? How did the diaphragm control breathing? What caused the face to show expression? The answers were there, in the flesh, waiting to be discovered by someone willing to look closely enough. The Last Supper. While working as Milan's court engineer, Leonardo was commissioned to paint a mural in the refectory of Santa Maria del Grazia Monastery. The subject was the Last Supper, Christ's final meal with his disciples before his arrest and crucifixion. This was a common subject. Every monastery had a Last Supper painting in its dining hall. The traditional composition was simple. Christ and the 12 disciples arranged in a line along a table, halos identifying the holy figures, Judas usually separated or identified by holding a money bag. Leonardo rejected this formula entirely. He wanted to capture a specific moment in the narrative, the moment immediately after Christ announces that one of the disciples will betray him. The scene isn't static religious iconography, it's human drama, 12 men reacting to shocking news. He spent years planning the composition, not years painting, years planning. He would stand in front of the wall for hours staring, making no marks, then he'd suddenly rush forward, add a few brushstrokes, and leave. Days might pass before he returned. The prior of the monastery complained to Ludovico Sforza. "The painter is lazy," he said. "He stands around doing nothing. He's wasting time." Ludovico summoned Leonardo to explain himself. Leonardo's response revealed his understanding of creativity. The prior thought painting was manual labor, that productivity meant hours spent applying paint. Leonardo knew it was mental labor. The real work was solving problems in his mind. The actual painting was just execution of decisions already made. Sometimes he'd work all day without touching a brush, figuring out how a hand should gesture or how fabric should fold, and accomplish more than someone who'd been painting mechanically for hours. The finished mural is a masterpiece of psychological drama. Each disciple reacts differently to Christ's announcement. Some are shocked, others angry, others confused, others defensive. Judas, rather than being separated, sits among the others but recoils slightly, his face shadowed, his hand gripping the money bag. The composition uses perspective brilliantly. The room in the painting appears to be an extension of the actual refectory, as if the disciples are dining in the same space as the monks. The perspective lines all converge on Christ's head, making him the automatic focal point while the chaos of the disciples' reactions swirls around him. But Leonardo made a crucial technical error. Traditional fresco technique required painting on wet plaster, which meant working quickly in small sections. Leonardo couldn't work that way. He needed time to think, to revise, to experiment with colors and techniques, so he developed his own method, a kind of tempera and oil mixture applied to dry plaster. This allowed him to work slowly, to make changes, to achieve effects impossible with traditional fresco. But it also meant the painting started deteriorating almost immediately. Within 20 years, large sections were flaking off. Within 50 years, it was badly damaged. The Last Supper is Leonardo's most famous work after the Mona Lisa, but what we see today is mostly restoration. Layers of repainting by various artists trying to preserve or restore what Leonardo created. The original surface is largely gone, victims of his experimental technique and centuries of humidity. Yet even in its damaged state, the power is obvious. This isn't religious iconography. It's human beings experiencing genuine emotion. The disciples aren't saints having a formal meal. They're men who've just been told someone they trust will betray them, and their confusion and anger and fear are palpable. Leonardo had transformed a common religious scene into a study of human psychology, of how people react to shocking information, how groups fragment under stress, how gestures and expressions reveal inner states. It's simultaneously a religious painting and a work of observational psychology, sacred and profoundly human. The science of water. Leonardo was obsessed with water. He filled hundreds of pages in his notebooks with observations of how water flowed, how it created patterns, how it interacted with obstacles, how it moved through pipes and channels. This wasn't abstract interest. Water was crucial technology in Renaissance Italy. Cities needed aqueducts to bring clean water and canals to transport goods. Mills needed water power. Fortifications needed moats. Agriculture needed irrigation. Understanding water meant understanding the foundation of civilization. But Leonardo went far beyond practical concerns. He studied water the way a modern physicist might, trying to understand the fundamental principles governing its behavior. He observed that water flowing around an obstacle created specific patterns of vortices and eddies. He documented how water falling from a height created spirals and foam. He measured how the speed of flowing water changed with depth and distance from shore. He conducted experiments, testing variables, trying to isolate causes. He built models, small-scale versions of rivers and canals where he could control conditions and observe results. He was doing experimental fluid dynamics centuries before it existed as a formal science. His drawings of water are extraordinary. He could capture the chaos of turbulent flow, the spiral of a vortex, the pattern of waves with a precision that's almost impossible to achieve. These weren't artistic interpretations. They were scientific illustrations, accurate representations of observed phenomena. He noticed that water and air followed similar principles, that they were both fluids, that understanding one helped understand the other. This led him to study wind, clouds, storms, atmospheric phenomena. He was recognizing something that wouldn't be formalized for centuries, that different systems can follow the same underlying principles, that water and air and even fire all behave as fluids, governed by the same mathematical laws. This understanding informed his engineering projects. He designed canal systems for Milan, figuring out how to move water efficiently, how to handle elevation changes, how to prevent silt accumulation. He proposed flood control systems for rivers, dams, and diversions that would protect cities while providing irrigation. Most of these projects were never built, either because the cost was prohibitive or because Leonardo's designs were too ambitious for available technology. But the principles were sound. Modern hydraulic engineering uses concepts Leonardo sketched in the 15th century. His water studies also fed his art. The backgrounds of his paintings often feature rivers, lakes, distant mountains with water flowing down them. He could paint water convincingly because he understood it structurally, knew how it actually behaved, rather than relying on artistic conventions. There's a famous drawing, a study of a deluge, that shows an apocalyptic flood destroying everything. The water isn't just crashing randomly. It's following physical principles, creating specific patterns of spirals and vortices even as it destroys. It's both terrifying and beautiful. Chaos that follows laws, destruction that's somehow elegant in its execution. The dream of flight. Nothing fascinated Leonardo more than the possibility of human flight. He filled page after page with observations of birds, studies of wings, designs for flying machines. If birds could fly, he reasoned, then humans could fly too. It was just a matter of understanding the principles and building the right mechanism. He started by observing birds with the same intensity he applied to everything. He watched how they took off, how they maintained altitude, how they turned, how they landed. He noticed that wings weren't just flapping randomly. They twisted in specific ways, creating shapes that pushed against the air differently during the downstroke versus the upstroke. He dissected birds, studying the structure of wings, the arrangement of feathers, the muscles that controlled flight. He measured wingspan relative to body weight, trying to figure out the proportions necessary for flight. He observed different types of birds, noting that each species flew differently depending on their wing shape and size. From these observations, he began designing human-powered flying machines. The earliest designs were ornithopters, devices with wings that flapped like a bird's. A person would lie prone, operating pedals and levers that moved the wings up and down. In theory, if the wings were large enough and the person strong enough, the machine would lift off the ground. He never built a full-scale ornithopter, but he built models, tested them, observed that they didn't work quite right. The problem was power. Human muscles can't produce the sustained power output necessary for flapping flight. Birds have specialized flight muscles that make up a huge percentage of their body weight. Humans can't. No amount of training would make flapping flight possible. So Leonardo modified his designs. If humans couldn't match birds muscle for muscle, maybe they could find other ways to stay aloft. He designed a parachute, a pyramid of wooden frame covered in linen. Jump from a high place, and the air resistance would slow your fall. He claimed a person could jump from any height without injury if they used his parachute. He designed a helicopter, a screw-shaped device that would lift straight up by rotating rapidly. Multiple men would run around the perimeter, turning the screw, creating lift. It wouldn't have worked with human power, but the principle was sound. The problem wasn't the concept, it was the power source. He designed gliders, fixed-wing devices that could ride air currents without needing to flap. These were closest to being practical. With the right design and enough altitude, a person could glide for considerable distances. But Leonardo had no way to test them. There were no suitable hills near Milan, and building a glider without being certain it would work seemed too risky. His flight studies led him to investigate aerodynamics. He observed how birds adjusted wing angles to control their flight. He noticed that air flowing over a curved surface moved faster than air flowing over a flat surface, creating pressure differences. He was discovering the principles that would eventually explain how wings generate lift. But he didn't have the mathematics to formalize these observations. The tragedy is that Leonardo understood so much, but could build so little. His designs for flying machines anticipated actual working aircraft by 400 years. The Wright brothers' airplane used principles Leonardo sketched. Helicopters work essentially how Leonardo imagined. Parachutes are shaped differently now, but operate on the same basic principle he identified. But in his lifetime, none of it could be built. The materials were too heavy. The power sources didn't exist. The manufacturing precision necessary to create working mechanical systems wasn't available. He was a man designing 20th century technology with 15th century tools, and the frustration must have been immense. Yet he kept sketching, kept observing, kept trying to solve the problem. His notebooks contained the phrase, "Tomorrow I will fly," written multiple times, a promise to himself that he knew he probably couldn't keep but couldn't stop making. The perfect city? The plague hit Milan in 1484, killing thousands. The disease spread quickly through the crowded, filthy streets where sewage ran openly, and buildings pressed together, blocking light and air. Leonardo walked through the dying city, observing, taking notes, thinking about how this could have been prevented. His conclusion: Milan's design itself was killing people. The city had grown organically over centuries, buildings added wherever there was space, streets following ancient paths, no planning or organization. This created conditions perfect for disease: density, darkness, filth, no ventilation. So he designed a perfect city, one where disease couldn't spread, where people could live healthily and comfortably. His plan was radically advanced, anticipating urban planning principles that wouldn't be implemented for centuries. The city would be built on 2 levels. The upper level would be for people: wide streets, plenty of open space, buildings designed to maximize light and air circulation. The lower level would handle everything dirty: sewage, deliveries, industrial work. Waste would flow through engineered channels, constantly flushed by diverted river water. Streets would be wide enough that buildings couldn't shade them completely. Public spaces would provide gathering areas separate from traffic. Buildings would follow standardized designs, ensuring adequate light and ventilation. Population density would be controlled, preventing the dangerous overcrowding that created disease conditions. He designed the infrastructure, water supply systems, sewage removal, waste disposal, everything needed to keep a city clean and functional. He thought about traffic flow, separating different types of movement to prevent congestion. He planned for future expansion, ensuring the design could grow without losing its organizing principles. The plan was brilliant, comprehensive, utterly impractical. Building a new city from scratch would cost enormous amounts. Convincing people to abandon existing cities for an experimental design would be impossible. The engineering challenges were immense, the political obstacles insurmountable. Ludovico Sforza thanked Leonardo for the plans and did nothing with them. Milan continued growing organically, continued suffering periodic plagues, continued being exactly the kind of city Leonardo's design would have prevented. But the ideas didn't die. Centuries later, urban planners would rediscover the principles Leonardo sketched: the importance of ventilation and sanitation, the need for green space, the value of separating different urban functions. Modern cities implement features Leonardo proposed, usually without knowing he proposed them first. This pattern repeated throughout Leonardo's life. He would identify a problem, design a solution, present it to patrons, and watch nothing happen. The solutions were often too expensive, too complicated, or too far ahead of current capabilities. So they remained on paper, brilliant ideas that couldn't be realized, sketches of a future that wouldn't arrive for centuries. The mathematics of beauty. Leonardo believed beauty was mathematical, not that beauty was cold or mechanical, but that it followed principles, that there were proportions and relationships that the eye recognized as harmonious even if the mind couldn't articulate why. He studied the golden ratio, the mathematical proportion that appears repeatedly in nature, in the spiral of shells, the arrangement of flower petals, the branching of trees. He measured human bodies and found the same proportions appearing. The relationship between height and arm span, between different segments of fingers, between facial features. His drawing of the Vitruvian Man, the figure standing with arms and legs extended inside a circle and square, isn't just famous aesthetics. It's a mathematical statement. The human body embodies ideal proportions, relationships that are simultaneously functional and beautiful. But Leonardo didn't just copy nature's proportions. He understood them structurally, knew why certain proportions worked better than others. The golden ratio appears in nature not by accident, but because it's an efficient packing solution, a way to arrange elements in space that maximizes certain properties. This mathematical understanding informed his painting. The compositions weren't intuitive. They were calculated, using geometric principles to guide where elements should be placed, how large they should be, how they should relate to each other spatially. The Last Supper uses perspective with mathematical precision. The vanishing point falls exactly on Christ's head. The disciples are arranged in groups following mathematical proportions. Even the gestures follow geometric principles, hands and arms creating lines that direct the eye through the composition according to calculated paths. The Mona Lisa, his most famous painting, is a study in geometric harmony. Her pose follows the golden spiral. The relationship between her head and body, between foreground and background, between different elements of the composition all follow mathematical proportions, but the mathematics is invisible. You don't look at the Mona Lisa and see geometry. You see a woman mysterious and alive. The mathematical structure creates harmony that the eye recognizes as beautiful without conscious awareness of the underlying principles. This is what Leonardo understood, that art and science aren't opposites. They're complementary approaches to the same goal, understanding and representing reality. The artist needs to know what the scientist knows. The scientist needs to see what the artist sees. Beauty and truth aren't different things. They're the same thing approached from different angles. The perpetual motion problem. Leonardo was fascinated by machines. by mechanisms that transformed one type of motion into another. He filled his notebooks with studies of gears, pulleys, levers, springs, ratchets, every kind of mechanical system. But there was one machine he knew was impossible: the perpetual motion machine, a device that would run forever without external energy input. Many inventors claim to have built such machines. Leonardo knew they were all either frauds or self-deluded. His reasoning was based on observation, not formal thermodynamics, which wouldn't be developed for another 300 years. He noticed that friction always reduced motion. A spinning wheel would eventually stop unless something kept pushing it. Water flowing downhill could be used to do work, but you had to constantly add water at the top. Nothing moved forever on its own. This led him to a crucial insight. You can't get more energy out of a machine than you put in. In fact, you always get less out because friction and other losses consume some of the input energy. This is essentially the first law of thermodynamics, stated casually in Leonardo's notebooks 4 centuries before it was formalized. He applied this understanding to evaluate proposed inventions. When someone presented a design claiming to generate unlimited power, Leonardo could identify where the reasoning failed, where the hidden energy input was, or why the machine would stop after a few cycles. But this created a problem for his own inventions. Many of his designs required power sources that didn't exist. The helicopter needed an engine. The tank needed something more powerful than human muscles. The flying machines needed sustained power output beyond biological capability. He experimented with springs, trying to store energy that could be released slowly. He designed gear systems that could multiply force. He tried to harness wind and water more efficiently, but there was no escaping the fundamental limitation. The energy had to come from somewhere, and available sources were limited. This is why so many of Leonardo's inventions remained unrealized. Not because the designs were flawed, but because the power problem was unsolvable with Renaissance technology. The concepts were sound, the engineering was brilliant, but without engines, without electricity, without the energy density of modern fuel, they couldn't work. He understood this limitation, wrote about it explicitly in his notebooks. Yet he kept designing, kept sketching impossible machines, as if the act of imagining them might somehow bring them closer to reality. Or perhaps he was designing for a future he knew he'd never see, leaving blueprints for people who would eventually have the tools to build what he could only imagine. The Mona Lisa. Around 1503, Leonardo began painting a portrait of Lisa Gherardini, wife of a Florentine merchant. It was a standard commission, nothing particularly noteworthy. The merchant wanted a portrait of his wife. Leonardo needed money. Simple transaction, except Leonardo never delivered the painting. He kept it, worked on it intermittently for years, possibly for the rest of his life. He carried it with him when he moved from Florence to Milan to Rome to France. He died with it still in his possession, never having finished it to his satisfaction. What made this portrait so important that Leonardo couldn't let it go? On the surface, it's straightforward. A woman sitting, hands folded, slight smile, mysterious expression. The composition is classical, nothing revolutionary. But the execution is something else entirely. Look at her hands. They're the most perfectly painted hands in existence, every detail of skin and bone and tendon visible, yet soft, alive, absolutely convincing. Look at the transparent veil over her hair, so finely painted you can see individual threads. Look at the landscape behind her, impossible mountains and winding paths, created with atmospheric perspective that makes distant objects fade and blue, exactly as they do in reality. But what really makes the painting extraordinary is the face. She looks alive, not just well painted, but actually alive, as if consciousness exists behind those eyes. The smile is famous for being enigmatic, impossible to read. Is she happy, sad, amused? You can't tell, and that ambiguity is precisely the point. Leonardo understood something about facial expression that other artists missed. Real expressions are never pure. People don't smile with simple happiness or frown with simple sadness. Real emotion is complex, layered, ambiguous. The Mona Lisa's smile captures this complexity, shows that human expression can't be reduced to simple categories. He achieved this through technique he spent years perfecting: sfumato. The subtle blending of tones to create soft, almost imperceptible transitions. There are no hard edges in the Mona Lisa's face. Everything blends, just like in reality, where edges between light and shadow are gradual, not sharp. He built up this effect through countless thin layers of paint, each one nearly transparent, working slowly, probably using his fingers as much as brushes to blend the boundaries. The result is skin that looks like skin, not paint representing skin. It's so convincing that viewers often feel the painting is watching them, that the eyes follow you around the room. This is why he never finished it. There was always one more layer to add, one more subtle transition to refine, one more tiny adjustment that would bring it closer to perfection. And perfection wasn't a goal he could reach. It was an asymptote, something he could approach infinitely, without ever quite touching. The merchant who commissioned the painting never got it. He paid Leonardo, eventually gave up asking for delivery, commissioned another artist to paint his wife. Leonardo didn't care. The painting wasn't for the client anymore. It was his laboratory for exploring the limits of what painting could achieve. His attempt to create life on a wooden panel. Today it's the most famous painting in the world, protected behind bulletproof glass, viewed by millions who stand in line for hours to see it. Most are disappointed. It's smaller than expected. The colors are darker. Reproductions don't prepare you for how subtle it is, how all the effects that make it extraordinary are too fine to photograph well. But for those who look carefully, who spend time really seeing rather than just checking it off a list, the magic is still there. 500 years after Leonardo painted it, the Mona Lisa still looks alive. The unfinished projects. Leonardo's life is a catalog of unfinished projects. The Adoration of the Magi, abandoned after the underdrawing. The Battle of Anghiari, a massive mural that he started then left incomplete. The equestrian statue for Ludovico Sforza, a bronze horse that would have been the largest in the world, for which he built a full-scale clay model that was destroyed when French soldiers used it for target practice. A cathedral in Milan commissioned him to design a dome. He submitted plans. Nothing was built. He was hired to divert a river to create a navigable canal. He spent years planning. The project was abandoned. He proposed flood control systems, fortification upgrades, architectural improvements. Almost nothing was implemented. His notebooks are filled with partially completed investigations. He'd start studying a problem, fill 20 pages with observations and sketches, then move to something else, leaving the investigation unresolved. The light studies, the geology investigations, the botanical observations, most trail off without conclusions. Why? The easy explanation is that Leonardo couldn't focus, that he was so distractible he couldn't see anything through to completion. But this misunderstands how his mind worked. For Leonardo, understanding was the goal, not completion. Once he figured out how something worked, actually building it, or finishing the painting, or writing up formal conclusions seemed unnecessary. The intellectual challenge was solved. Why waste time on execution when there were so many other mysteries to investigate? This drove his patrons insane. They wanted finished products, paintings they could display, fortifications they could use, canals that actually transported goods. They didn't care about Leonardo's understanding of optics or hydraulics or anatomy. They cared about deliverables. But Leonardo worked for himself first, for patrons second. He took their money and used it to fund his investigations. If those investigations happened to produce something useful for the patron, wonderful. If not, he'd move on to the next investigation, the next question, the next mystery. This meant most of his genius remained hidden. The paintings that were finished are masterpieces, but there are fewer than 20 of them. The inventions that were built mostly didn't work because the technology wasn't available. The scientific investigations were never published, never shared with the scholarly community, never built upon by others. His notebooks were scattered after his death. Some were lost. Others sat in private collections for centuries. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that scholars began piecing together what Leonardo had discovered. And the revelations were shocking. He'd understood principles of anatomy that wouldn't be formally described for another 200 years. He'd sketched inventions that wouldn't be built for 400 years. He'd conducted experiments in physics and engineering that anticipated modern methods. He'd been a scientist in an era before science existed as we understand it. But none of this had an impact during his lifetime because he never finished or published anything. His genius was private, locked in notebooks written in mirror script, filled with drawings and observations that made sense to him, but were inaccessible to everyone else. This is Leonardo's tragedy. He saw so much, understood so deeply, imagined so far into the future, yet left almost no legacy in his own time. He was a secret genius, brilliant beyond measure, but ineffective at translating that brilliance into cultural impact. The final years. In 1516, at age 64, Leonardo accepted an invitation from King Francis I of France. Francis was young, cultured, fascinated by Italian Renaissance ideas. He offered Leonardo a position with no specific duties. Live in France, pursue whatever interests you, teach me when I visit. Leonardo accepted. He spent his final years in a manor house at Amboise, near the king's chateau. Francis visited regularly and Leonardo would talk for hours, showing sketches, explaining ideas, discussing philosophy and art and science. The young king was enchanted by this old man who knew everything, who had spent his life investigating reality with unmatched intensity. Leonardo brought 3 paintings with him: the Mona Lisa, still unfinished, a painting of John the Baptist, and the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne. He worked on them occasionally, adding tiny refinements, unable to declare any of them complete. But mostly, he organized his notes. Thousands of pages accumulated over decades, filled with everything he'd observed and invented and discovered. He tried to impose order, to create treatises on specific subjects: painting, anatomy, water, flight. But the project was too vast. The notebooks resisted organization because Leonardo's mind had resisted organization, jumping from subject to subject as connections occurred to him. His right hand was partly paralyzed, probably from a stroke. He could still draw with his left hand, could still sketch ideas, but the fine motor control necessary for painting was diminished. This must have been devastating for someone who'd spent his life creating precise, subtle images. He died on May 2, 1519, at age 67. The traditional story says he died in King Francis's arms, but this is probably romantic fiction. What's certain is that he died far from his birthplace, in a foreign country, still holding on to paintings he'd never finished, surrounded by notebooks filled with ideas that wouldn't be understood for centuries. His estate went to his assistant Francesco Melzi, who inherited thousands of pages of notes, sketches, and drawings. Melzi tried to organize them, tried to prepare some for publication, but the task was overwhelming. After Melzi died, the notebooks were scattered, sold, divided among collectors. Many were lost, others survived by accident. The irony is that Leonardo's greatest legacy, the notebooks, had almost no influence for 300 years. While his paintings were famous, while he was recognized as a great artist, the full scope of his genius remained hidden. The anatomical discoveries, the engineering designs, the scientific observations, all remained buried in private collections, unknown to the world that could have used them. It wasn't until the late 19th century that scholars began serious study of the notebooks, began piecing together what Leonardo had actually accomplished. And the more they discovered, the more astonishing it became. This wasn't just a great artist who also dabbled in science. This was someone who anticipated modern scientific method, who designed technologies centuries before they could be built, who understood principles of physics and biology that wouldn't be formalized for generations. The modern world he saw. Everything around us, the technology we use daily, the scientific understanding we take for granted, the engineering principles that shape our world, Leonardo anticipated it. Not all of it, not every detail, but the fundamental principles, the basic approaches, the core insights. Flight is possible through careful study of aerodynamics. Leonardo knew this. Designed flying machines based on observation of how air moves over curved surfaces. The fact that working aircraft weren't built until 1903 doesn't diminish his understanding. He lacked engines, not insight. Human anatomy can be understood through dissection and careful observation. Leonardo knew this, conducted dissections that revealed structures doctors wouldn't formally describe for 2 centuries. That his discoveries remained in notebooks doesn't mean he didn't make them. Cities should be designed with sanitation, ventilation, and traffic flow in mind. Leonardo knew this, designed an ideal city incorporating these principles. That it wasn't built doesn't mean modern urban planning didn't eventually reach the same conclusions. Water and air follow the same fluid dynamics principles. Leonardo knew this, studied both as variations on the same phenomenon. That formal fluid dynamics wasn't developed until the 18th century doesn't mean he didn't understand the basics. Machines can transform one type of motion into another, but you can't get more energy out than you put in. Leonardo knew this, understood conservation of energy before it was formalized as a law of physics. Mathematical proportions underlie beauty in nature and art. Leonardo knew this, used the golden ratio and other geometric principles in his compositions. That we now have formal aesthetic theories doesn't mean he didn't already understand the concepts. The eye works like a camera, focusing light through a lens onto a surface that captures the image. Leonardo knew this, dissected eyes, drew diagrams showing how the system worked. That he didn't have the vocabulary of modern optics doesn't mean he didn't understand the principle. Over and over, Leonardo reached conclusions that science would later confirm. He did this through observation, through experiment, through careful reasoning from evidence. He was doing modern science before the scientific revolution, before Galileo and Newton formalized the methods Leonardo was already using. But he was limited by his era. He couldn't build most of what he designed. He couldn't publish his findings in a way that would influence others. He couldn't even fully develop his ideas because the mathematical and theoretical frameworks didn't exist yet. Imagine what Leonardo could have accomplished with modern tools. Give him a computer and CAD software, and he'd design wonders. Give him access to materials science and manufacturing techniques, and he'd build working versions of his machines. Give him modern mathematics, and he'd formalize principles he could only sketch intuitively. Or imagine modern scientists with Leonardo's approach. The same relentless curiosity, the same refusal to specialize, the same willingness to connect seemingly unrelated fields, the same insistence on direct observation over received wisdom. What problems might be solved by people who think like Leonardo but have access to tools he never imagined? This is his ultimate legacy, not the paintings, extraordinary as they are, not the inventions, brilliant as they were, but the approach. Look carefully, question constantly, make connections across disciplines, draw to understand, test ideas through experiment, trust observation over authority, pursue knowledge for its own sake, regardless of practical application. Leonardo was a man 500 years ahead of his time, trapped in an era that couldn't fully appreciate or utilize his genius. Yet he kept observing, kept sketching, kept investigating, kept trying to understand how reality actually works. And in doing so, he left us a model of what human curiosity can achieve when freed from the constraints of specialization and conventional thinking. The modern world he anticipated has finally arrived. We live surrounded by technologies he sketched, using principles he discovered, solving problems he identified. We've caught up to Leonardo da Vinci. The question is whether we can cultivate the kind of mind that sees 500 years into the future, that makes connections no one else sees, that understands the world so deeply that understanding itself becomes a form of art. That's the challenge Leonardo leaves us. Not to match his specific accomplishments, but to match his approach. To look at reality with the same intensity he did. To question with the same relentlessness. To create with the same devotion to understanding. In an age of increasing specialization, Leonardo reminds us that the deepest insights come from seeing connections across boundaries, from refusing to stay within the safe confines of a single discipline. He was many things: artist, scientist, engineer, anatomist, geologist, botanist, inventor. But more than any of these, he was curious. Endlessly, relentlessly, exhaustingly curious. And that curiosity, combined with the skill to investigate what he was curious about, made him the closest thing to a universal genius humanity has produced. The modern world exists because eventually, centuries later, people began asking the same questions Leonardo asked, began investigating the same phenomena he investigated, began applying the same rigorous observation he applied. We built the world he imagined. The tragedy is that he never got to see it. The gift is that he showed us it was possible.